Little Black Lies. Corporate and Political Spin in the Global War for Oil by Jeff Gailus. Chapter 2. Not all facts are equal. The environmental disorder which we face at this time is the result of the discrepancy between man's intentions and his achievements. Quote by Pierre Dansereau in a 1972 Macy lecture. In 2008, as the cancer scare in Fort Chip was garnering headlines, Alberta Premier Ed Stelmach made a trip to the United States to tell American politicians the truth about Alberta's tar sands development, part of the Alberta government's multi-million-dollar Tell It Like It Is public relations campaign. In the face of mounting pressure from environmentalists and an impromptu visit from blockbuster Hollywood director James Cameron, the Alberta government budgeted more than $10 million over 2 years to promote the province abroad, in particular to highlight the responsible, clean, and sustainable development of the tar sands. Pro-Alberta ads were run in both New York City's Times Square and London's Piccadilly Circus, and the government spent more than $50,000 to run an ad in the Washington Post. It was really an op-ed the Post had refused to print, in support of TransCanada's Keystone XL pipeline. The emphasis, as always, was on the facts. Jerry Bellica, a spokesperson from Premier Stelmach's office, told the CBC, "A lot of the critics out there, people who want to shut down the oil sands, aren't constrained by facts. We felt it was important for us to get out some factual information." The ads were simple, and each tried to address one of the criticisms that had been heaped on the Alberta government over the previous months. Biodiversity. Only a fraction of 1% of Alberta's boreal forest has been disturbed by oil sands mining. Yes. 7.5 million seedlings planted, and counting. Yes. Water usage. Oil sands projects require water. Yes. Oil sands projects recycle 80 to 95% of water used. Yes. Greenhouse gas emissions. Oil sands projects produce greenhouse gas emissions. Yes. Oil sands projects produce less than 0.1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes. Innovative solutions. Meeting consumer demand for oil. Yes. Demanding innovation. Yes. There are other facts, of course, facts that didn't make it into the government's ad campaign or onto its website. Facts such as these. Biodiversity. Tar sands development will alter 140,000 square kilometers of wildlife habitat and will very likely extirpate woodland caribou herds that are listed as threatened under Alberta's Wildlife Act and Canada's Federal Species at Risk Act. Yes. Thousands of wolves will be intentionally shot and poisoned in an ineffectual attempt to save the caribou from disappearing. Yes. Water. Extracting and upgrading 1 barrel of bitumen requires 1.5 to 4 barrels of water. Annual water consumption reached 170 million cubic meters in 2011, equivalent to the annual resident use of 1.7 million Canadians. Yes. Tar sands mining has created tailings ponds covering 176 square kilometers, an area 50% larger than the city of Vancouver, and containing 830 million cubic meters of toxic slurry, full of salt, phenols, benzene, cyanide, heavy metals such as arsenic, and dozens of other carcinogens. Yes. These toxic tailings ponds are estimated to leak as much as 12 million liters a day into the surrounding soil and water. Yes. As mines expand production, these tailings ponds are predicted to increase to 250 square kilometers by 2020. Yes. Greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas emissions for bitumen extraction and upgrading are estimated to be 3.2 to 4.5 times as intensive per barrel as for conventional crude oil produced in Canada or the United States. Yes. Tar sands are the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, accounting for approximately 6.5% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions, and they will double between 2009 and 2020, from 45 million tons in 2009 to 92 million tons by 2020. Yes. Essentially, the entire projected increase in Canada's emissions between 2005 and 2020 will come from tar sands operations. Yes. Innovative solutions. There are no meaningful technological solutions to any of these problems. There is no strategy in place to protect caribou herds and the habitat they require. Yes. There is no known method of reclaiming tailings ponds. Yes. And there is no way to meaningfully reduce greenhouse gas emissions from tar sands production. Yes. The best way to figure out where the truth lies is to conduct high-quality, peer-reviewed scientific research. To substantiate their claims, Premier Stelmach and his industry allies relied for years on the results of the Regional Aquatics Monitoring Program, RAMP, one of more than a dozen organizations and government agencies monitoring the air, land, and water in what has become known as the oil sands region. Initiated in 1997, RAMP is an industry-funded, multi-stakeholder environmental monitoring program that integrates aquatic monitoring activities across different components of the aquatic environment, different geographical locations, and Athabasca oil sands and other developments in the Athabasca oil sands region. Although the Alberta government refers to RAMP as a multi-stakeholder group, the program is largely dominated by the oil industry. It receives almost all of its funding from companies operating in the oil sands region, including all the big ones: Canadian Natural Resources, Imperial Oil, Petro-Canada, Shell Canada, Suncor Energy, Syncrude Canada, and Total E&P Canada. RAMP's ostensible goal is to identify and address the long-term trends, regional issues, and potential cumulative effects related to oil sands and other development. For years, RAMP collected data on climate, hydrology, fish and invertebrate health, and water quality. And for years it concluded that tar sands development was having no measurable impact on the regional environment. What pollution it did find was simply explained away as the inevitable product of naturally occurring bitumen deposits, rather than industrial development. The oil sands are a very unique resource, and oil sands development does bring unique environmental challenges, Premier Stelmach told an audience of U.S. business people and members of Congress. Alberta's oil sands are concentrated near the Earth's surface. Contaminants are picked up naturally through waterways and enter the ecosystem. As a province, we monitor water quality carefully, and to date, all of the data shows no long-term effects of water quality from oil sands development. The Federal Minister of Environment at the time, Jim Prentice, made similar claims, staunchly defending Ottawa's monitoring efforts. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and the Oil Sands Developers Group, well-heeled lobbyists for the industry, parroted the same line. One Alberta government bureaucrat even went so far as to claim that by removing the toxic bitumen from the ground, the oil industry was actually improving the health and function of the boreal ecosystem, of which bituminous sand has been a part for millions of years. There are two ways to get bitumen out of the ground. What you see promoted in anti-oil sands campaigns are the great open-pit mines and the toxic lakes of wastewater that accompany them. Giant excavators strip the land of its forests and wetlands to get at the bitumen beneath them, turning a lush green ecosystem into an industrialized wasteland that astronauts can see from outer space. 400-ton dump trucks, the size of houses, haul the bitumen-soaked sand to processing plants, where it is bathed with hot water and caustic soda. Open-pit mining operations have already removed some 700 square kilometers of boreal forest, an area the size of the city of Edmonton, but only about half of the land already approved for surface mining. If oil sands developers have their way, strip mining will turn 4,750 square kilometers of boreal forest into a moonscape reminiscent of the battlefields at Verdun. Processing bitumen creates large tailings ponds, which are actually small lakes full of toxic wastewater, behind berms rising hundreds of feet on either side of the Athabasca River. An average of 1.5 barrels of mine tailings accumulate for every barrel of bitumen produced, which means nearly 200 million liters of tailings are produced daily, enough to fill the Toronto Sky Dome. Together, the ponds already cover a whopping 176 square kilometers and contain 830 million cubic meters of toxic slurry, more than twice the volume of Alberta's Sylvan Lake. As mines expand production, these tailings ponds are predicted to grow to 1.2 billion cubic meters by 2030 and cover more than 250 square kilometers. But, as the Triple Alliance likes to remind us, the ugly open pit mines and tailings ponds are a relatively small part of the industry's future. More than 135,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of Alabama, has been set aside for what is called in situ extraction. In situ, Latin for in place, refers to sites where the bitumen is too deep to be scooped up and trucked to factories. Instead, a network of wells are drilled and steam is injected, heating the bitumen so it can simply be pumped to the surface. In an effort to improve the development's public image, tar sands proponents have taken to marketing this less visible form of bitumen extraction as a new kind of oil. Although in situ extraction sites do not look nearly as foul as the pits and ponds, they are hardly less problematic. In situ extraction boils vast amounts of groundwater, with incredible volumes of natural gas, to inject steam into bitumen formations deep underground, consuming more water and emitting more greenhouse gases than mining does. Given the size and pace of industrial development in northern Alberta, it seemed inconceivable to David Schindler that all these mines and tailings ponds and smokestacks were not releasing at least some pollution into the surrounding environment, even if RAMP's monitoring efforts were unable to detect it. Although he is routinely dismissed by the oil industry, and even by members of the mainstream media, as a biased, anti-tar sands activist, Schindler is undisputably one of the world's most heralded aquatic ecologists. He has conducted research on the environmental impacts of acid rain, phosphates in detergents, and other serious environmental problems. Now Killam Memorial Professor of Ecology at the University of Alberta, Schindler founded the federal government's experimental lakes area near Kenora, Ontario, back in 1968. About the same time J. Howard Pugh started mining Alberta's bitumen. For 20 years he conducted interdisciplinary research on the effects of phosphates in detergents, acid rain, radioactive elements, and climate change on boreal ecosystems, and his work has been widely used to formulate ecologically sound management policy in Canada, the United States, and Europe. Dr. Schindler is a Fellow of the Royal Society and an Officer of the Order of Canada, and he has been awarded some of the world's highest science and environmental honors, including the first Stockholm Water Prize in 1991 and the Volvo International Environment Prize in 1998. He is, in other words, one of Canada's most respected scientists, who takes seriously his obligation to ensure that environmental and energy policy is based on sound science, and he has never been afraid to take on government and industry when environmental harm and human health are at stake. 30 years ago, Schindler conducted a thorough study of pollution resulting from industrial processes that burned large quantities of hydrocarbons. The report was published by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in 1981. And, quote, "We didn't find a single fossil fuel burner or ore smelter that did not discharge lots of toxins that fell back to the biosphere at various distances depending on the pollutant's properties. The tar sands burn coke, and they smelt ores at 500 degrees Celsius, and the snow is gray for miles around." End quote. It was the same with the watershed runoff. Scientists have been publishing research on the effects of watersheds stripped of soil and vegetation since the 1970s, and the findings are clear. New geological substrates exposed to rain and snow yield increased runoff of all the chemicals in the deposits. "It's watershed science 101, said Schindler. "If the oil sands were as free of pollution as the greenwashers claim, it would be equivalent to an immaculate conception." Indeed, other evidence has already indicated that things were not as clean and responsible as government and industry claimed. Environmental groups and First Nations living downstream had been raising the alarm for years. Independent research indicated that tailings ponds were leaking as much as 12 million liters of toxic liquid into the groundwater every day. And research conducted in laboratories indicated that bitumen-contaminated sediments often killed fish eggs. Fish that did survive such toxic wombs were plagued as adults by deformities, lesions, and hematomas. The same malformations that First Nations fishers were observing with increasing frequency in adult fish caught downstream from tar sands development. Perhaps most chilling are the high rates of rare cancers in Fort Chip, 300 kilometers downstream from the mines and tailings ponds, cancers known to be associated with toxins derived from hydrocarbon development. Even the federal government's own scientists were concerned that all might not be as it appeared. When a trio of federal government researchers reviewed RAMP's water monitoring protocols in 2004, they questioned whether the program's experimental design could even detect contamination. RAMP suffered from a serious problem related to scientific leadership, they concluded, pointing to problems of inconsistent sampling and methodology, as well as the inaccessibility of the data it used to draw its conclusions. In short, the reviewers expressed concern that the methodology RAMP was using to collect data was incapable of determining whether tar sands development was polluting the Athabasca River and its tributaries. Schindler and other scientists knew that little had changed to address these obvious deficiencies over the years, and yet politicians, bureaucrats, and the members of RAMP's industry-run monitoring program continued to claim that any pollution in the oil sands region were the results of natural seepage from underlying bitumen deposits, not industrial development. Something wasn't quite right, Schindler surmised, and he wanted to find out once and for all what it was. And so Dr. David Schindler, at 70, and well past the age when most of his colleagues had traded full-time employment for golf clubs and the relative ease of retirement, waded into the murky world of tar sands science to see what he could find. First, he raised the hundreds of thousands of dollars needed to conduct the necessary research. Then he put together a small team, including mercury expert Aaron Kelly and toxicologist Jeff Short, to conduct experiments designed specifically to test the claim that oil sands development was not polluting the land and water in the region. Together, they mounted 2 field expeditions in the region in 2008, one in the winter when the ground was covered in snow and ice, and one in midsummer, to see what they could find. They were not surprised by their results. Schindler, Kelly, and their team identified a wide variety of heavy metals lurking in the snowpack and the Athabasca River, some as far downriver as Fort Chip. 7 of the 13 toxic pollutants studied exceeded federal and Alberta guidelines for protecting fish and aquatic life, some by as much as 30 times. These heavy metals include mercury, arsenic, beryllium, copper, cadmium, lead, nickel, silver, thallium, and zinc. All are toxic and considered priority pollutants by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Arsenic is a known human carcinogen, and cadmium can harm kidneys and other organs. Long-term exposure to mercury can harm fetuses and cause many serious problems, including memory loss and tremors. Like mercury, lead is a neurotoxin that can cause blood and brain disorders. Kelly and Schindler's study also found that tar sands development was polluting the air and water with polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, a carcinogenic byproduct of upgrading bitumen into synthetic oil. Air pollution within a 50-kilometer radius of upgraders deposited enough bitumen and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons over a 4-month period to equal a 5,000-barrel oil spill on the Athabasca River watershed every year. For 13 years, RAMP had failed to see any of it. "This analysis is so basic," a frustrated Schindler told me over the phone. "The only thing that's innovative is that we did it in the oil sands." And we found what you find downstream of any industrial development that involves hydrocarbons. Schindler had promised the people of Fort Chip that he would make the long trek to their hometown to deliver the results in person. "Lead's gone up 4-fold in 6 years," he told a packed community hall, where distraught residents told story after story of relatives succumbing to rare and deadly cancers. The same for arsenic. It's gone up 3-fold in 7 years. We conclude that the oil sands industry is adding substantial amounts of contaminants to the river. Once Kelly and Schindler's research had been vetted and published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a prominent peer-reviewed journal, they arranged a press conference in Edmonton. Schindler held the deformed bodies of diseased fish in his huge, weathered hands as he delivered the news. You could hear the denial coming from a million miles away. RAMP quickly defended itself, claiming that it too had found elevated levels of toxins in the area that sometimes surpassed thresholds found in legislation and water quality guidelines, but that those results had been dismissed as resulting from naturally occurring compounds, rather than industrial activity. The Athabasca River and many of its tributaries in this particular region run through oil sands deposits, said Fred Kuzmic, a shell biologist, and the chair of RAMP's steering committee at the time. "It's not surprising that we would see these elevated concentrations downstream from oil sands operations, because oil sands operations are operating where these oil sands exist." Politicians took a similar tack. The federal environment minister at the time, Jim Prentice, initially dismissed Schindler's findings as allegations only, and maintained that federal scientists had always told him that contaminants were naturally occurring. When a media scrum cornered Alberta Minister of Environment Rob Renner, a former florist and the man responsible for ensuring that industrial activity didn't pollute Alberta's air or water, Renner dismissed the evidence out of hand. Despite the growing body of scientific evidence that put the lie to the Triple Alliance's claims, Renner raised his face to a crowd of TV cameras and repeated the same mantra that government and industry had been chanting for years. "There are compounds in the Athabasca River that are naturally occurring and have been there for thousands of years, and will always be there because of the nature of the geology in that area." "Okay, but there's a study refuting what you've just said," said the impatient voice of a reporter off camera. The study says that humans are causing it. You have nothing to point to that would refute that. I don't, stuttered Renner. I don't believe that's what the study says. Schindler, clearly exasperated, told reporters, "It doesn't seem to matter how good a research plan we put together. We're supposed to believe they have a database out there somewhere that refutes everything that we've shown? Well, we have our data out there for public display. Let's see theirs." Schindler, Kelly, and their colleagues were soon vindicated. Their research had drawn the world's attention and put the tar sands industry and the governments charged with regulating it in the spotlight. Soon after the results went public, Schindler got a phone call. Could he meet Minister Prentice for a quick conference at the Edmonton airport? Both Schindler and Kelly attended and walked Prentice through their research, showing him how they had designed the study and what they had found. Prentice asked Schindler what he should do. I told him about the idea for an independent scientific advisory panel, and he announced it the next day. The federal government's oil sands advisory panel was the first of numerous independent reviews of RAMP's monitoring program. The Alberta government, caught with its pants down in the blinding light of public scrutiny, and worried that Ottawa was going to interfere with the province's right to develop the tar sands as it saw fit, quickly announced its own inquiry. Canada's Commissioner of the Environment looked into the matter too, as did the Royal Society, which appointed a panel of its own. They all came to the same conclusion. It would be hard to design a worse monitoring program, if you tried. Environmental monitoring of tar sands development was disorganized, under-resourced, secretive, and ineffective. There was no way of telling what conditions were like before tar sands development started, and it was all but impossible to figure out how development had affected the region over the last 45 years. With the writing now on the wall, government and industry ceased their defense of RAMP and turned their efforts instead to the rather more difficult task of damage control. These ugly truths, long evident to Aboriginal elders and many scientists, have sent industry propagandists and government falsifiers back to their rooms for a long Christmas sulk, wrote journalist Andrew Nikiforuk, when the Federal Oil Sands Advisory Panel released its report just before Christmas, 2010. Yes, Virginia, there is a hell for liars. The federal government quickly put together a team of independent scientists and gave them 90 days to develop the world-class tar sands monitoring program it had been claiming it already had in place. Phase 1. A conceptual framework for a new world-class monitoring plan and a detailed water quality monitoring scheme for the lower Athabasca River was released in March 2011. A more holistic and integrated plan that includes effective monitoring of not only lakes and rivers, but also air, fish, invertebrates, and mammals was released in July. The price tag? $50 million, 2.5 times what is being spent now. The Alberta government released the results of its own Alberta Environmental Monitoring Panel in June 2011, which recommended the establishment of an independent environmental monitoring commission. In February 2012, 6 years after people of Fort Chip voiced their concern about the spate of rare and deadly cancers, a new federal Minister of Environment, Peter Kent, and his Alberta counterpart, Diana McQueen, stood side by side in Edmonton to unveil a new monitoring plan for the oil sands region. It still is not clear who will pay for it, or whether it will be overseen by government or a truly independent commission, but both Kent and McQueen were convinced that the new monitoring system would prove to the world how responsibly they were developing this critical global resource. It's hard to decide what to make of the Great Canadian Tar Sands monitoring fiasco, largely because what none of the panel reviews bothered to ask was how, in a developed country with a functioning democracy, The pollution monitoring system of the world's largest and most controversial energy development could be so deficient. It's not like we don't know how to do it. It's not like it hasn't been done elsewhere. In fact, proper monitoring had been carried out in the very same region 10 years before. The Northern River Basin Study provided scientifically sound information about the water and aquatic environment of the Peace, Slave, and Athabasca basins, which were being put at risk by increasing urban and industrial development, mainly forestry and pulp mills. Schindler points to this study as a model that could have been followed in the tar sands region. Absent an official independent review, there appear to be three competing theories. Optimists point to confusion as the most plausible answer. Despite the fact that representatives from the tar sands industry sat alongside scientists from the Alberta and federal governments at RAMP, some claim there was uncertainty about who is to monitor what, when, and to what ends. Others, including Schindler, believe those overseeing the monitoring program simply lacked the necessary expertise. Others are less kind and use the word incompetence. The more cynical among us suggest it may have been done on purpose. All you need to do is look at who benefited from a monitoring system that was unable to detect pollution. It seems impossible to believe that the Triple Alliance thought it could get away with using a faulty monitoring system, and yet it's not impossible to believe they might try it anyway. Worse things have been done in the name of progress. However late in coming, the unveiling of a world-class monitoring system is a positive step, but there is every reason to be skeptical that it will make much difference in the long term. For one thing, it will take years to implement. The plan calls for everything to be in place in 3 years, but given these governments' track record in implementing environmental management systems, it could well take longer. It will also take many more years, perhaps a decade, before improved monitoring efforts provide sufficient data that should already be available, to draw conclusions about the impact of the exponential growth of the tar sands. More important is to recognize that a monitoring system is designed only to monitor, not to regulate. If all goes well, dozens of scientists will gather mountains of data on air and water, fish and caribou. Scientists will analyze those data in their labs and on their computers, crunching numbers and computing statistics. 10 years from now, they'll publish their peer-reviewed studies which will tell us how fast caribou populations, legally listed as threatened, have declined, how much toxic pollution has been released into the Athabasca River, and perhaps whether that pollution is contributing to the cancer rates downstream, and whether technological advancements have reduced overall water use and greenhouse gas emissions. But the data itself and the scientists who provide it will not change a thing unless the government changes the rules in order to mitigate or eliminate the nasty consequences of turning bitumen into oil. Meanwhile, the Triple Alliance shows no sign of changing anything. Despite universal condemnation of the government's industry-led monitoring program by some of the best independent scientists on the continent, and despite Schindler's peer-reviewed research results, tar sands projects are being approved faster than ever. Incredibly, both the federal and Alberta governments are working on ways to streamline the environmental assessment process so they can start digging and drilling even faster. Meanwhile, websites of both government and industry still emphasize the fact that water in the tar sands region is being closely monitored, that monitoring stations downstream have not detected any problems, and that whatever surface water pollution we find is the result of naturally occurring bitumen deposits.